Your brain is managing thousands of stress signals right now. Not emotional overwhelm in the abstract sense, but actual biochemical cascades running through your hypothalamus, your amygdala, and your prefrontal cortex. Those cascades are releasing cortisol into your bloodstream, activating your sympathetic nervous system, and redirecting energy away from systems your body considers non-essential for immediate survival. That redirection is happening in your digestive system, in your immune function, in the neural networks responsible for memory consolidation. And it's happening whether you consciously feel stressed or not. Chronic stress isn't just about feeling anxious or overwhelmed. It's a sustained state of physiological alarm that over months and years rewires how your brain processes information, how your body regulates information, and whether your cognitive function stays sharp into your 60s and 70s or begins declining in your 40 stock chronic. It doesn't announce itself with a diagnosis or a blood test until the damage has already accumulated, usually in the form of memory problems, anxiety disorders, or neurodegenerative disease. The problem is that for decades, we've been told that stress is just a mental state. Relax more, meditate, take a holiday, and you'll be fine. Except that hasn't worked for most people. What we're now understanding is that chronic stress creates structural changes in the brain through hormonal pathways that have nothing to do with your mindset, and most people are experiencing these changes without recognizing the warning signs their brain is sending them. Hi, I'm Dr. Alex. I'm an emergency medicine doctor, and after nearly 10 years in AANDE, I've seen what happens when chronic stress goes unmanaged for years. And my goal now is to help people recognize the physical signs of stress overload before it leads to serious cognitive decline and live longer, healthier lives. For the next several minutes, I'm going to walk you through 8 hidden signs that your brain is under chronic stress. These aren't the obvious symptoms like feeling anxious or having trouble sleeping. These are subtle, specific changes that indicate your stress response system has been activated for so long that it's beginning to damage the very structure of your brain. And I just want to take a few seconds here to make you a promise. I promise to keep creating the most helpful videos I possibly can, grounded in science and the latest research to help you prevent the diseases I see in the emergency department every single day. And all I ask in return is that you give this fairly new channel a chance and hit the subscribe button. If you get to the end of this video and you didn't think it was worth your time or you've not learned something new, then feel free to unsubscribe. No hard feelings, but if you give me your time and your attention, I'll give you everything I've learned from over a decade in medicine. So please help me out, hit the subscribe button to help this channel reach more people like you, and let's continue with the video. Before we talk about the hidden signs themselves, we need to understand what chronic stress actually does to the brain at a biological level. When you encounter a stressor, your hypothalamus activates the HPA axis, which is your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This triggers the release of corticotropin-releasing hormone, which signals your pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, which then tells your adrenal glands to pump out cortisol. In an acute stress situation, this is exactly what you need. Cortisol mobilizes glucose for energy, sharpens your focus, and prepares your body to respond to a threat. The problem is that this system was designed for short-term activation. A predator appears, you fight or flee, the threat passes, and cortisol levels drop back to baseline. But in modern life, the stressors don't stop. Work deadlines, financial pressure, relationship conflict, chronic sleep deprivation, all of these keep the HPA axis activated continuously. When cortisol stays elevated for weeks, months, or years, it becomes neurotoxic. High cortisol levels damage the hippocampus, which is the brain region responsible for memory formation and emotional regulation. It shrinks the prefrontal cortex, which handles decision-making, impulse control, and complex thought. And it enlarges the amygdala, which is your brain's fear center, making you more reactive to perceived threats. This isn't just functional impairment, this is structural brain damage that shows up on MRI scans. And the warning signs we're about to discuss are your brain's way of signaling that this damage is already underway. Hidden sign number 1 is word-finding difficulty that's getting progressively worse. This is not the occasional moment where you can't recall someone's name. This is a pattern where you're frequently searching for common words, mid-sentence, where you know exactly what you want to say, but the word itself won't come to you. What's happening is that chronic cortisol exposure impairs the connections between your hippocampus and your language processing centers. The hippocampus is essential for retrieving stored information, including vocabulary. When it's under chronic stress, those retrieval pathways become less efficient. A study published in Neurology found that people with elevated cortisol levels performed significantly worse on memory and language tests, and had measurably smaller hippocampal volumes on brain scans. This isn't normal aging, this is stress-induced cognitive decline, and it's reversible if cortisol levels are brought back under control. Hidden sign number 2 is an inability to make decisions about trivial things. You're standing in the supermarket, unable to decide which type of pasta to buy. You're scrolling through restaurant menus for 20 minutes, unable to choose what to order. You're paralyzed by small choices that used to be automatic. This is called decision fatigue. But what's actually happening is that your prefrontal cortex is overwhelmed. Chronic stress depletes the neurotransmitters your prefrontal cortex needs to function, particularly dopamine and norepinephrine. Without adequate neurotransmitter availability, the executive function networks that handle decision-making become impaired. Research from the Journal of Neuroscience has shown that chronic stress reduces dendritic branching in the prefrontal cortex, which means the neurons literally have fewer connections to work with. Every decision, even a trivial one, requires more effort because your brain doesn't have the processing capacity it used to. Hidden sign number 3 is increased sensitivity to sounds, light, and sensory input that didn't used to bother you. The sound of someone chewing becomes unbearable, bright lights feel physically painful, background noise makes it impossible to concentrate. This is sensory overload, and it's a direct result of an overactive amygdala. When you're under chronic stress, your amygdala becomes hypervigilant. It's constantly scanning your environment for threats, and it interprets neutral stimuli as potentially dangerous. That heightened sensitivity isn't just psychological, it's neurological. Studies using functional MRI have shown that people with chronic stress have exaggerated amygdala responses to sensory input compared to people with normal stress levels. Your brain is stuck in a state of hyperarousal, and it can't filter out irrelevant information the way it should. Hidden sign number 4 is emotional blunting, where things that used to bring you joy or sadness no longer generate much feeling at all. You're not depressed in the classic sense, you're just emotionally flat. This happens because chronic cortisol exposure downregulates dopamine receptors in your brain's reward pathways. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter responsible for motivation, pleasure, and emotional engagement. When your dopamine system becomes less responsive, activities that used to feel rewarding no longer trigger the same neural response. Research in the American Journal of Psychiatry found that people with chronic stress show reduced activation in the ventral striatum, which is the brain region that processes reward, when exposed to positive stimuli. Your brain's emotional range is literally being compressed by prolonged stress hormone exposure. Hidden sign number 5 is skin problems that won't resolve, particularly acne, eczema, or psoriasis flare-ups that have no clear external trigger. This seems unrelated to brain stress, but it's not. Your skin is heavily innervated by nerves that communicate directly with your central nervous system. When your brain is under chronic stress, it releases neuropeptides, like substance P, which travel through nerve fibers to your skin and trigger inflammatory cascades. The inflammation worsens skin conditions and slows healing. Studies published in JAMA Dermatology have shown that stress-induced neuropeptide release increases mast cell activation in the skin, which is what causes the redness, itching, and breakouts that characterize stress-related skin conditions. Your skin is essentially broadcasting the inflammatory state of your nervous system. Hidden sign number 6 is unexplained digestive issues, particularly irritable bowel syndrome symptoms like bloating, cramping, and alternating constipation and diarrhea. The gut-brain axis is bidirectional, meaning your brain controls your gut and your gut sends signals back to your brain. When you're under chronic stress, your brain diverts blood flow away from your digestive system and reduces the production of digestive enzymes, because digestion is not a priority during a threat response. It also increases gut permeability through stress-induced changes in tight junction proteins in the intestinal lining. That increased permeability allows partially digested food particles and bacterial endotoxins to cross into your bloodstream, triggering systemic inflammation that affects both your gut and your brain. Research in gastroenterology has shown that people with chronic stress have measurably different gut microbiomes compared to people without chronic stress, with reduced diversity and increased populations of pro-inflammatory bacterial species. Your digestive symptoms are a manifestation of your brain's stress response affecting your entire gastrointestinal tract. Hidden sign number 7 is frequent minor infections and slow wound healing. You're getting colds more often than you used to. Small cuts take longer to heal. You feel like your immune system isn't working properly. That's because it isn't. Chronic cortisol exposure suppresses immune function by inhibiting the production and activity of white blood cells, particularly T cells and natural killer cells. Cortisol also reduces the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines that are necessary for fighting infections and initiating tissue repair. This is why people under chronic stress are more susceptible to viral infections and bacterial infections, and why their recovery times are longer. Studies in psychosomatic medicine have demonstrated that people with elevated cortisol levels have lower antibody responses to vaccines and higher rates of upper respiratory infections compared to people with normal cortisol levels. Your immune system is being actively suppressed by the same stress hormones that are damaging your brain. Hidden sign number 8 is a consistent pattern of waking up between 2 and 4 in the morning and being unable to fall back asleep. This is not insomnia in the traditional sense. You can fall asleep initially without difficulty, but you wake in the early hours, often with your mind racing or feeling inexplicably alert, and you can't get back to sleep. What's happening is that chronic stress disrupts your circadian cortisol rhythm. Normally, cortisol should be at its lowest point in the middle of the night. But when you're under chronic stress, cortisol can spike during what should be your deepest sleep phase. That spike triggers wakefulness and activates your sympathetic nervous system, which is why you often wake feeling anxious or with your heart racing. Research in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism has shown that people with disrupted cortisol rhythms have fragmented sleep architecture, meaning they spend less time in deep restorative sleep, even when they're technically asleep. This creates a vicious cycle, because poor sleep further elevates cortisol, which further disrupts sleep, which continues to damage your brain. Now here's what most people don't understand. These hidden signs aren't just symptoms of stress. They're evidence that chronic stress has already caused measurable changes in your brain structure and function. By the time you're experiencing word-finding difficulty, decision paralysis, and sensory overload, your hippocampus has likely already shrunk, your prefrontal cortex has reduced connectivity, and your amygdala has become hyperactive. The good news is that the brain has remarkable plasticity. Hippocampal volume can recover, prefrontal cortex connectivity can be restored, amygdala reactivity can be reduced. But it requires lowering cortisol levels and maintaining them at normal levels for extended periods. This is not something you can achieve with a weekend spa retreat or a 10-minute meditation app. It requires addressing the root causes of chronic HPA axis activation. So what actually reduces chronic stress at a biological level? 3 primary mechanisms. First, you need to restore proper sleep architecture. Deep sleep is when your brain clears metabolic waste products, consolidates memories, and repairs stress-induced damage. Chronic stress disrupts sleep, and disrupted sleep perpetuates stress. Breaking this cycle requires prioritizing sleep hygiene, which means consistent sleep and wake times, eliminating blue light exposure in the evening, keeping your bedroom cool and completely dark, and avoiding caffeine after midday. Studies have shown that even small improvements in sleep quality can significantly reduce cortisol levels within weeks. Second, you need regular physical activity that's intense enough to create an adaptive stress response, but not so intense that it becomes another chronic stressor. Moderate aerobic exercise reduces baseline cortisol levels, increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is the protein that promotes new neural connections, and improves hippocampal function. Research in psychoneuroendocrinology has demonstrated that people who engage in regular moderate exercise have lower cortisol responses to acute stressors and better cognitive performance compared to sedentary individuals. Third, you need to eliminate or significantly reduce exposure to chronic stressors where possible. This sounds obvious, but most people underestimate how much their environment is contributing to their stress load. Constant notifications, news consumption, toxic relationships, jobs with no autonomy, financial insecurity, all of these keep your HPA axis activated. Reducing exposure doesn't mean eliminating stress entirely, which is impossible. It means identifying which stressors are modifiable and taking concrete steps to change them. In emergency medicine, we don't typically see people coming in with chronic stress as their primary complaint. But we see the downstream consequences constantly. Panic attacks that are actually stress-induced tachycardia. Chest pain that's stress-related musculoskeletal tension. Cognitive confusion in otherwise healthy people that's caused by prolonged cortisol exposure. What becomes clear when you work on the front line is that chronic stress isn't a soft diagnosis. It's a physiological state that produces real measurable damage to multiple organ systems, particularly the brain. The patients who avoid cognitive decline as they age are not the ones who never experience stress. They're the ones who recognize when their stress response system has been activated for too long and take action to reset it before permanent damage occurs. So where does this leave you? The 8 hidden signs we've discussed are not definitive diagnostic criteria. They're indicators. They're your brain's way of signaling that your stress response system has been overactive for so long that it's beginning to cause structural and functional impairment. If you're experiencing multiple of these signs, it doesn't mean you're headed for dementia or a mental breakdown. It means your cortisol levels have likely been elevated for an extended period, and that you need to take concrete steps to bring them back under control. That might require working with a healthcare provider to measure your cortisol levels, addressing sleep disorders, changing your work situation, or implementing stress reduction strategies that are evidence-based rather than aspirational. The goal is not to eliminate all stress from your life, which is neither possible nor desirable. The goal is to prevent your stress response system from remaining chronically activated to the point where it damages the organ that's supposed to be managing it. Your brain is resilient, but it's not invincible. And finally, please subscribe to the channel if you found this useful to help me reach more people like you.